Just into our newsroom, this is coming from Washington, where U.S. President Donald Trump is speaking in the Oval Office. He is commenting on the situation in Syria. Let's listen in here on CBC News Network.
But Mike is leaving. Mike Pompeo will be meeting also, who's here right now with us, and he's going to be joining the meeting. We have a lot of great people over there, we'll see. In the meantime, our soldiers are not in harm's way, as they shouldn't be, as two countries fight over land. That has nothing to do with us. And the Kurds are much safer right now, but the Kurds know how to fight. And as I said, they're not angels. They're not angels. If you take a look, you have to go back and take a look. But they fought with us. We paid a lot of money for them to fight with us, and that's okay. They did well when they fought with us. They didn't do so well when they didn't fight with us. When I refused to allow the Americans a year and a half ago to fight with the Kurds against Iraq, I said, wait a minute, this country stupidly just spent a fortune on fighting for, with, around Iraq. Nobody knows how they spent it, but they spent, actually, we're in the Middle East now for $8 trillion, if you can believe that stupidity. But in Iraq, we're in for probably $5.5 trillion. So they're telling me, wait a minute, we just spent $5.5 trillion fighting in Iraq and with Iraq, and now we're supposed to spend money to fight with the Kurds against Iraq. I said, no, thank you. So what happens is, when I said we're not going to fight with the Kurds left. They didn't want to fight against Iraq, which right now isn't the greatest fighting force in the world. That happened twice. The Kurds actually are pulling back substantially from Turkey, and Syria is pulling in. Syria probably will have a partner of Russia, whoever they may have. I wish them all a lot of luck. You know, Russia was involved in Afghanistan. It used to be called the Soviet Union. Now it's called Russia for a reason, because they lost so much money in Afghanistan that they had to downsize, a very big downsizing. So if Russia wants to get involved with Syria, that's really up to them. They have a problem with Turkey. They have a problem at a border. It's not our border. We shouldn't be losing lives over it. But again, we only had 28 soldiers. It was 26, 28. I got all different numbers. It ends up being 28. Between the 26, 28, two people, and they're fully accounted for.
This was Donald Trump in the Oval Office talking about the U.S. stance and with the situation in Syria. You have to wonder, though, where does this leave U.S. diplomats? Donald Trump still says Secretary of State Mike Pompeo expects to meet Turkey's president face-to-face. Pompeo and U.S. Vice President Mike Pence are traveling to Turkey for a possible meeting tomorrow with Recep Tayyip Erdogan. So far, Turkey is refusing the latest pleas to end the fighting in Syria, and the Turkish president is giving Kurds a new ultimatum. Intense fighting rages in a strategic city the Turks claim to have captured days ago. Turkey is trying to drive Kurdish forces from a 30-kilometer-wide zone in northern Syria. Erdogan says the onslaught will continue unless the Kurds pull out of the zone by tonight. The United Nations warns the humanitarian crisis is growing as the fighting intensifies. We've got freelance journalist Rebecca Collard in Beirut. She has more on international efforts to end the violence.
We've had for days calls from international organizations, from European powers, and of course, and probably most significantly, from the U.S., for this Turkish offensive in northern Syria to stop. The U.S. has called for a ceasefire. It has threatened sanctions, put trade deal talks on hold in an effort to pressure the Turkish president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, into stopping this offensive in northern Syria. Now we know that Vice President Mike Pence and the U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo are going to head to Turkey, and they're hoping to meet with the Turkish president to discuss this offensive. Now, we're hearing conflicting reports, as you said, Suhana, about whether or not this meeting will take place. We've seen comments to both effects from the Turkish leadership, and it may be that instead of a meeting with Erdogan, what they're going to get is a meeting with their diplomatic counterparts. So we're going to have to wait and see what happens on that front. But I think what this is pointing to is a much bigger picture change in Syria, Suhana, and something we've been talking about for the last few days. The U.S. has pulled its troops out of Syria, And now in those places where those U.S. troops used to be, we have Syrian fighters and we have Russia. And essentially with that troop movement, with those U.S. troops leaving Syria, so has the U.S.'s influence. And that is not to say, Suhana, that the U.S. does not have influence in the Middle East at all anymore, that they don't have influence on Turkey. Of course, Turkey is a NATO partner. They're a trade partner for the U.S. But I think what we're seeing and what we're seeing in these developments is that the U.S.'s influence in Syria is definitely declined significantly. And because of that, we don't even know whether or not these top U.S. officials are going to get a meeting with the Turkish president, Suhana.
I know you'll be watching to see what comes out of any meeting. If it happens, so will we. Now, I want to move on to the United Nations raising those grave humanitarian concerns. Rebecca, what are you hearing on that front?
I mean, we're talking about, we've seen really varied estimates about how many people have been displaced by this fighting, Suhana, in the last just over a week. The Kurdish-led administration in northern Syria has put the number close to 300,000 people. We've seen UN figures much less than that, closer to around 160,000. But I'll tell you something, having talked to aid organizations that are working on the ground, they're of course concerned about the displaced people and about where they will go, because we know that there's restrictions as far as entering Iraq at the moment, that it's been difficult for these families to actually enter to Iraq. That border is not wide open. But the other thing is that they are increasingly concerned about being able to access people that are displaced inside Syria. So, you know, because of the fighting, obviously it's difficult for humanitarian organizations to act, and we've heard of some of them actually leaving. But the last thing I would say, Suhana, and I think this is something that we've seen and I've heard from humanitarian organizations throughout the Syrian conflict, that this situation where there's a transfer of authority from the Syrian Kurds, backed by the U.S., to very quickly we have Syrian government troops coming in, backed by Russia. In this situation where we have a transfer, a very quick shift of authority, this is a dangerous situation for humanitarian actors to act in. And because of that, the people there are at even greater risk, Suhana.
That's freelance journalist Rebecca Collard in Beirut.